Perfect. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the COVID-19 Survey Working Group. This is a working group supported by the Converge program out of the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council here in Canada. We're a group of researchers that gather together across different sectors, from government, from academia, from think tanks, from the private sector, to learn and talk about COVID-related survey research. This is a group that gets into the nitty-gritty of how research is done, and we get into those methodological conversations about what we're learning about survey research as we go, what we still need to learn and what challenges we face, and what we can share in an international context. We have folks joining in on this call from across multiple continents right now, live streaming in as we hear the session with Pew Research, as well as folks watching live on YouTube. Whether you're joining on the Zoom call or on YouTube, you're welcome to ask questions as we go. Feel free to use the chat function to do that, and that will let me curate things into the conversation as we proceed through. Now, we normally have a chance at the beginning of meetings to share updates with the group that's working here in the working group, but there aren't any updates that have been requested to share, so I will take prerogative as the organizer here and share just one quick thing that is going on at a logistical level for the working group as a whole. So I should mention, for those watching, my name is Dr. Eric Kennedy. I'm an assistant professor of disaster and emergency management at York University in the emergency management program here. And I'm excited to be able to help facilitate and lead this group. I just wanted to give a heads up to group members that I will be sending out an email in the coming week or so, looking to get you to share some of your priorities in terms of ongoing research, questions and focuses for this group. Basically, what are the areas that we should be paying more attention to in terms of where we need to exchange knowledge? What are some of the gaps in survey research that are occurring? And what are some of the focuses that we should have in these conversations going forward? This is part of what we've been asked to do by the UC Boulder team, is report back on a research agenda for this organization and for the groups, but it will also help to inform the speakers that we invite in. So please do not hesitate to share back when I send that email around. If you're watching on YouTube, you can always join the group via the sign up at the Semper Lab website, and that link will be posted into the description. With that, I don't want to waste any more time before we get on to the guest speakers for today. This is a really exciting conversation for me because Pew Research was an early inspiration in my life as a researcher. Many, many years ago, before I knew much of anything, I actually had a chance to serve as an intern with the Pew Forum, compiling distribution lists and doing other sorts of research-related tasks. And so Pew was actually one of the first influences to really shape me and mold me as a researcher. And so it's such an honor to have two incredible figures from the Pew community join with us today. We have in conversation Carrie Funk, who's the Director of Science and Society Research at the Pew Research Center. She has authored an incredible number of reports and projects around people's trust in science, the role in science in society, and intersections with things like science news. We also are joined by Scott Keeter, who is a senior survey advisor at Pew Research Center and provides an incredible amount of methodological guidance for the teams working there. These two will be an excellent providers of information and experts in the field to have join us. And so what I'll do is I'll pass it to them. They'll share with us some of the methodological aspects of their COVID research for about 20 minutes or so. At any point, if you have questions, throw them into the chat, and we'll turn this into more of a Q&A as we get into the second half of the hour. So with that, Carrie and Scott, thank you so much for being here today.
All right, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. We have just a few slides to keep things started on our conversation. But when I looked at how Eric built this talk, Pew Research Center, a think tank, will be with us, and I'm like, okay, let's think about that in terms of the nature of the research we're doing. You know, that actually it's essentially, there's three main people producing public opinion research around this time, types of institutions. One are kind of media polls. The other is, I would say, government and academic researchers in the same bucket, and we're somewhere in the middle. And we kind of get closer to the media poll side because of the speed with which we're trying to produce research. We do a variety of projects, some of which are kind of longer range projects, but when we all were faced with the pandemic and the scope of the pandemic, we moved into a kind of faster mode than we would have, putting us more on the side of how can we capture this moment and start to figure out how to track what's going on as quickly as possible. Needless to say, it's a pretty hard task. Nobody really could understand what the scope was of what we were dealing with, what the full implications are of what we were dealing with. And so I want to leave you with at least one of our failed attempts. We have probably many more failed attempts, but there is a way in which what we did was we threw a whole lot of minds at the puzzle and we tried a lot of things. We had the resources to try a lot of things, but I would also say there are other kinds. Data is cheaper these days, so you can actually try a lot of things in a non-expensive way. But we tried a lot of things, and some of them have been working out, and some maybe less so. And one of the ways in which we've been doing that is we have all those fresh minds to bounce ideas off of. The collaborative process at Pew Research Center is very important. It's kind of just a core philosophy about our work that putting people together, you get better product, essentially. More minds at the table, you know, and that way, more diverse experiences at the table, you're going to get better efforts to capture the essence of public opinion. So that's one way we did it. And then we have people like Scott and a handful of others who are trying to kind of look at the 20,000-mile high view and kind of keep an eye on what are we capturing? Are we getting the right concepts? Are we figuring out what are the core kind of concepts that we need to track over time? So I'm going to try to share this screen, which of course I didn't try before. Naturally, Eric, I don't know if I can see it. I'm not seeing it, Eric. Am I? It's probably me. It's no doubt it's me. I do have it open, which I do know is numero uno in issues. Do you want to just pop that up there, and then I won't have to agonize? Is that a possibility?
I can pull that up. Just give me a second to do that.
All right. Well, you pop that up there. We won't be agonizing. So that's kind of the opening, and we could say more. Our organization is around 180 some people. We're a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trust. So this is philanthropic dollars that is allowing us to do this, and everything we do is made public. We publish it on the website, and almost everything we do is available as a downloadable data set. Usually not at the moment of data collection release, but at some point in the process, not so long after. The bread and butter of what we do has often been based on the idea of trends, and thank you, of tracking opinion over time, and we can go ahead and go forward. And so this is just one example. So right there, starting in mid-March, we were starting to go in the field, and the most recent here is going to be August. But this is one example that I think worked pretty well. We asked 4 questions actually to track over time about what people thought of, whether the degree to which they saw the coronavirus outbreak as a threat, in this case, a major threat to public health, to the US economy, and then we had 2 more items about the personal health level and the personal financial situation level. But in mid-March, we took an early read. A couple weeks later, we saw that spike up in terms of the degree of public concern. And then we also started to see pretty early on the kind of widening of political divisions around issues related to the coronavirus outbreak. And this is the one that I always come back to, I think, because it's such a fundamental issue. It shows the political divide underneath this, that in terms of people's perceptions of the US economy, you see that, roughly 8 and 10 of both Republicans and Democrats say this is a major threat to the US economy. There's agreement on that. But on the other side, you see this wide difference of opinion between Democrats and Republicans on the degree to which the outbreak itself is posing a public health threat. So that, I think, has turned out to be a really useful trend that we put into place early on, and captures, kind of the essence of kind of a major element of public sentiment. And I guess we should move forward. I wanted to just talk about data that I knew better. So this is data that I had more of a hand in, and also data that reflects that one of the things we're all interested in is predicting the future, which is pretty much a difficult thing to do. Nobody actually can predict exactly what they'll do, but we're capturing expectations on top, and then down below, people's estimates of whether or not they would get a coronavirus vaccine if it were available today. And the way we saw a lot of different ways to measure this, but the way that we approached it was to allow people to say that they would definitely get it, probably get it, definitely not get it, or probably would not get it. And that just reminds us of how difficult it is to track these things. But then if we move forward, the key thing is not so much, the key thing there is to see the trend. So then, let's see, from early May to middle of September, we see, roughly a 20-point drop across pretty much every group, every demographic group, in the degree to which, the certainty with which they would get a coronavirus vaccine. So that, and that's what matters. It doesn't, the exact percentage is not necessarily how many will get the coronavirus vaccine, but what it's tracking is that sentiment, that rise in uncertainty about whether or not you would do it. I think we can go forward. I think we can go forward. One of the things we wanted to do in this September survey in terms of views about a coronavirus vaccine was to try to unpack why people would not get it, where vaccine hesitancy might be coming from. And this is probably, it's a common puzzle that we all face in terms of why are people saying this. And one of the common approaches that we have methodologically is generally to start with some kind of open-end exploration, which we often do in non-probability surveys. And that kind of helps us see what issues are rising to the top from spontaneous responses. And then we use that to devise questions, item questions, that allow us to measure how prevalent those reasons are. So in this case, I think it worked out reasonably well. We were able to capture the main reasons and put them on the table that people would have. And certainly in terms of responses, we see that two reasons really stood out. One is concern about side effects, and the other is just generally wanting to know about how well it works, which we interpreted as more about essentially effectiveness, how well it works. It's concerns about the side effects and the effectiveness seem to be the biggest drivers in terms of people who were less likely to get that vaccine. Go ahead and move forward. And then I wanted to turn to other kinds of measures that have been on our plates, and and I think are on some of your plates, which is the idea of how do you track people's experience with coronavirus itself. So again, our team had a hand in putting these measures on the table. We were thinking that they would be useful to track over time, and they're kind of useful. This is my example to get us going on some of our failed attempts. The top measure, I'll just point out that it's a checklist essentially, right? Did you or didn't you? This is yes or no, I've done this. And one of the things we wanted to capture there was this degree of public anxiety. So have you taken your temperature at home to check if you might have had COVID-19? That is, in essence, that's also allowing people to say yes to something so that these other measures that are meant to be a little more technical get hopefully a better read on the yes, on the percent saying yes. But so the first item is really to capture that sense of public anxiety. Did you do something related to the potential that you had COVID-19? And then because it was so hard to get testing at the time, it was difficult to qualify to get tested, and certainly took a long time to get tested. We captured a kind of a vague idea of, well, you're pretty sure you had it, because people were talking about self-diagnosis at that time. And then used an approach that's more similar to government surveys. Have you been diagnosed by a healthcare provider, with the idea that that would give us this more perfect measure. And then people were also talking at the time about using antibody tests to kind of bypass some of that testing. So they're rooted in, these measures were trying to be things that we could track over time. They're going to be the ones that, we had to adjust a little bit, because they're rooted in the facts on the floor, on the ground, so to speak, and those didn't stay the same. At the bottom of this slide, what you see here is these two measures actually, I think, have turned out to be very helpful for us. Just asking, in terms of people's experience with coronavirus, do you know someone who was diagnosed with the disease? Do you know someone who is hospitalized or died due to COVID-19? That turned out to be really helpful for us in terms of capturing a sense of direct experience of people who had the disease, and certainly the hospitalized or died question allowed us to capture the people who were kind of most severely impacted. And as it turned out, as I think, as you've seen across much data, as it turned out, Black Americans in particular stood out for higher levels of knowing someone who had been hospitalized or had even died from the disease. All right, and then just turn one more. So this was a second version of whether or not you'd been tested. So this is to say, like, just, was from May to August, it's like we were going back in the field and we looked at those measures, and they just didn't look like something that we could stick with because things had changed. So in particular, we kept are you pretty sure you've been diagnosed with a disease? But we kind of broadened out the share of people who could have been kind of officially diagnosed, and allowed it to be just, have you tested positive for COVID-19? And again, that reflected changing experiences, because now you weren't necessarily getting diagnosed by a healthcare provider. You might be going to a pharmacy or other provider that you're just getting the test results. So we had to change that. We couldn't keep our trend, which we do give up only when we have to. And so what that means is we don't have a direct comparison over time. But as it turned out, it was a small share that had tested positive, and it's still a small share. So it didn't really have a huge impact on the estimates, but we just can't get that exact growth, the potential for growth over time that we might have wanted. I think I have one more slide. I'm pretty sure I have one more slide, which is just to be able to hand off to Scott Keeter. That my big success at this meeting is asking Scott to come talk with you all. He's the real methodologist in this group, and I in particular hope that Scott will tell us a little bit about how we built the panel, because what we do to collect these surveys is we have our own kind of representative survey panel, and Scott is the mastermind behind building that and has been helping to feed and care for that over the time. And I think that so much of our more interesting, methodological work comes from our efforts to make sure we have a good quality sample. And we've been continuing to do that over time. So, Scott?
Thanks, Carrie. Yes, so let me say a couple of things about how we do our methodological work at the center. We have what is now, I believe, a 7-person methodology team led by Director of Survey Research, Courtney Kennedy. She's my successor. I was in that role for a number of years. And then we have a number of different methodologists at different levels, a couple of PhD level methodologists, and the rest with master's or bachelor's degrees. And that team advises all of the projects on the major studies that they conduct, some of them extremely complicated. And that team also manages the American Trends Panel, which is what Carrie was talking about. So the American Trends Panel is a probability-based survey panel that we built in 2014. We noticed all through the aughts of this century and into the teens that telephone response rates were steadily declining. We were pleasantly surprised that the quality of the data that we were getting from telephone surveys, despite response rates going down to 10% and lower, were still good. And so we weren't driven away from telephone surveys because of concerns about data quality, although I think that's always something one could be worried about when you have response rates that are below 5% or 3%. But it was cost. Telephone surveys, particularly using lots and lots of cell phones because of the special laws in the United States about dialing cell phones. They have to be dialed manually to comply with federal regulations. Ended up just leading to enormous cost escalations in our survey budgets. And so we decided we would build a survey panel. It started out as an experiment. We built it. It was about 4,000 people in the first iteration, and we recruited people to the panel off of the back of a telephone survey. We took them through an entire long telephone survey, and then we asked them if they joined the survey panel, and about half of them did. So we used that model for a couple of years, but we found that there were certain problems with it. One was that the people that we were recruiting probably were a little more survey savvy because they had survived a 20-minute telephone survey on politics. They were a little more engaged in politics than we think was healthy. We knew that the people who accepted the panel invitation were more politically engaged than the people who didn't accept it. And so we decided to switch, and we shifted from recruiting off of an RDD survey to using an address-based sample. So very large mail survey, drive people to the web. And then in the first couple of years of the panel, we were interviewing people who did not have internet access by mail. So we produced a parallel mail questionnaire, sent it to people, and that's how we got the views of people who did not have internet service. That was a very unwieldy process. It posed all kinds of problems for methodological experiments and other things, like just being more nimble and able to turn surveys around quickly. So we now use a model that's very similar to what the Knowledge Panel, which is managed by Ipsos, uses, which is to provide people who do not have internet access with a tablet computer and an internet plan so that they can take part in our surveys. Fast forward to today, the panel is now over 15,000 members. We think the quality of the sample is much better with address-based sampling. We've been able to do special recruitments to try to boost the representation of Hispanics and especially Spanish-speaking Hispanics. And also people, younger people and people with lower levels of education through careful stratification of the samples that we send out. So, I could talk forever about panels, and I think it's, for those of you who been doing research, that panels have some very positive things. They also have some negative things. You have to worry about things like panel conditioning, people becoming professional survey responders. We try to avoid that by mixing up the topics. We don't do more than 2 surveys a month with our panelists. Even at that, I think there's some risk, especially on topics that we come back to fairly frequently, including politics. That's one reason it's great to have Carrie's team doing the science surveys. It provides some, I think, welcome variation in the content that our panelists are exposed to. But there are just all kinds of advantages. In the long run, despite the tremendous expense in standing up the panel in the first place, the panel becomes increasingly cost effective the more you interview the same respondents. At the same time, you're accumulating a tremendous amount of information about the panelists. You have lots more data about them demographically, politically, economically, than you can get in a reasonable length cross-sectional survey. And so I'll just say a couple more things, and then I'll hush. But one of the things that we are trying to do more of with the panel is use the panel as a panel, and that is actually track individual level change over time. And regrettably, the COVID-19 situation has given us a perfect opportunity to do that. One of the lessons that I think emerged out of the Great Recession of 2008 and afterwards is that people who were displaced economically by the catastrophe that happened in 2008 financially suffered long-term unemployment and mental health consequences and other things that you can certainly capture in cross-sectional surveys, but if you actually have a panel and you can follow individuals over time, you can get much more texture about what the consequences of these kinds of catastrophes, national catastrophes, international catastrophes are. And so we have, in addition to a lot of the work that Carrie talked about, we have begun asking people about the economic consequences, job loss, income loss, jobs regained. Once you regain a job, do you still make as much as you did before? We've asked mental health questions twice on the panel thus far for the purpose of trying to assess what consequences has the pandemic had for people's mental health. And going forward, we hope to be able to keep most of the panelists that we currently have and be able to track what happens to them. We can see very clearly that there is, I think we even heard it in the presidential debate, if any of you survived that last night, the idea of the K-shaped recovery, the K being that one group of people recovers quickly from the economic shock and another group of people just keep getting worse and worse off from it. And we're seeing very clear evidence of that in our asking. One of the most recent surveys we did, we asked people if they've been able to save more money than they did before the pandemic, less money, or about the same, or maybe they haven't been able to save money at all ever. And we can see quite clear evidence that there are people who are doing reasonably well financially. So happy to talk about any aspect of all of this. And, between Carrie and I, hopefully we can represent our colleagues in terms of the other research that we've done, but look forward to the conversation.
Carrie, Scott, thank you. That has just been absolutely fantastic to get this introduction. And I'm full of questions, and there are already a bunch of great questions in the chat. And so what I'm going to try and do is structure these into sort of chunks that we can try to take on, to talk a little bit more about the panel first, and then be able to get into things like item development and data analysis. And so I'll try to pull in the questions from the chat as we go in a way that makes sense thematically. And if you're listening, please do add whatever questions come to mind. We'll try to cover as many of them as we can. Okay, so let's start by talking about this panel, because I'm curious to learn about how you handle a problem that challenges all of us as survey researchers in terms of things like getting low socioeconomic status folks into the panel, getting folks who are coming from different linguistic backgrounds, folks who might have recently arrived in the country or from minority language communities. Can you tell us a bit about how you deal with those challenges in the panel, mostly because this is a challenge we face in a lot of our surveys, is how to do this well?
Yes, I'm happy to take a swing, and if Carrie wants to chime in. We recruit the panel in both English and Spanish. We haven't recruited in languages beyond that because there's simply too many of them. It would be prohibitively expensive for us to do so. Fortunately, English and Spanish in the US covers the vast majority of the population. And so we do have, we do have some confidence that we're doing a pretty good job there. But you're exactly right. Low literacy individuals, people with low levels of education, they're underrepresented in our panel. Fortunately, we have found that the address-based sampling method has helped us considerably in terms of the demographic representativeness. We still skew too educated, but not as much as we did when we were recruiting off of the telephone. Now, there are strategies that we could pursue. There's another panel that many of you may be familiar with, which is called the AmeriSpeak panel that's run by NORC at the University of Chicago. And they have a phase of recruitment to their panel that's face-to-face. They do a subsample of non-respondents, and they try to recruit some share of those individuals who they believe to most likely be in these very rare categories that we want to have more of face-to-face, and then they incentivize them. They do another thing that we don't do, which might be something we should consider in the future, and that is rather than insist that everybody take surveys online, they allow people to take surveys by telephone. That creates a mode issue for the researchers. So if you want to do something that involves showing people something, or you need the benefit of the self-administered data collection, then you can't do that as easily in the AmeriSpeak panel as we can do in ours. But I think that the trade-off there is that they probably do get a better representation of sort of low literacy individuals. So those are the kinds of trade-offs. I mean, I think that if we were to spend considerably more money on recruitment, we might be able to blunt some of that. And I think that would be a good thing if we had the money to spend.
Always a challenge. I mean, I think of some of the cost in getting folks, again, in a mail-based sample into our survey and the challenges there. Can you talk a little bit about attrition from your panel? Do you do top-up of different participants? How do you monitor that kind of participation level engagement?
We do regular quality checks, so we make sure that we're keeping up with our panelists. We send them reminders, and we sometimes will goad people a little bit if they haven't taken part recently. But there is some attrition, and that's unavoidable. We keep a very close watch on who it is that we're losing, and you can probably predict that we're losing the kinds of people that we can't afford to lose. We're not losing educated, white males as much as we're losing people of color and younger people, people who are more mobile. So we do top up the panel. We have a recruitment every year. We had a targeted recruitment a year ago in which we made a special focus on recruiting Hispanics and Latinos and Spanish-speaking Hispanics and Latinos. We offered differential incentives so that people who are demographically underrepresented in the panel are given larger per survey incentives and a larger joining incentive. And so these are things that we try to do to combat those problems, but they're a real challenge. I wouldn't kid you.
There is a question in the chat here about response rates and the like. I'm wondering if you can tell us about that kind of aspect of some of these COVID studies.
I don't have a response rate in front of me, but we're getting very good from the people who are in the panel. We're getting typically 75% or more of them taking, all of the surveys that they're invited to. We have a very engaged panel. It's a kind of a double-edged sword because sometimes you'd like them to be a little more like the population, but the upside of it is that we have a very cooperative group of people. We also have a very high rate of recruitment success. That is, among the people who get the address-based sample survey, which is a drive people to the web to take a short survey, they qualify, a very high percentage of them, over 90%, will actually join the panel. And, we may lose some of those before they actually become regular participants. But we're optimistic that we're going to get we have a goal right now of getting a complete cumulative response rate from recruitment to individual waves up to 15%. We're nowhere near there now. We're still in single digits. But it's getting better every year because a larger portion of the panel has been recruited by ABS.
Really helpful. Thank you. And I'm really, obviously this is an incredible infrastructure that you've built, and it must have helped a great deal in rolling out some of these COVID related projects. And so on that note, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more, Carrie. Early on, you had hinted at the change in temporalities here, right? As we shifted into doing COVID-based work. Aside from having the panel to work with, can you tell us a little bit logistically and theoretically how that change in tempo affected you and how it influenced the work that you were doing at first and doing now on COVID?
Sure. Good question. I'm still just admiring. Aren't you glad I brought Scott? Because so it's really fantastic to have that expertise in the room. How did it change us? It meant that we did not take the time to do a lot of testing. We had to go with what we could right now. The deadline is now. You need your question now. It needs to be in the field now. So you have that level of pressure. And actually, the other thing that's unusual about, I think, Scott and I as individuals is we're two people in the room who have actually worked in media polling, at Pew Research Center, and in academia. So we actually have seen the full gamut of the pressure that you can be under to produce research. And I think we've both done the kind of research where you can take your time and do lots of background testing and build scales and do all sorts of things. And we've also done, it's due right now, you have 1 hour, go. So it's much more of that ilk, that you have to just use everything you know, use as much as you can to make sensible choices and roll with it.
So to go a little further there, can you walk us through how you developed some of the items for the COVID-19 work? Perhaps give us an example of items that worked well and how you developed them, and items that ended up problematic later and the process there.
Yes, we're going to we may have Scott talk about his economic items on this one too. I tried to run through a few. You're trying to translate the broader context into what is it that people need to express in a survey question. And so that's basically what you use as your inspiration. So for example, I knew that there was a tension around the issue of social distancing. So you knew that you needed questions that allowed people to both express support for the idea of social distancing, as well as kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, objections or hesitation or a sense that this is exaggerated. So we've done a variety of things to kind of capture that, to allow both of those main points of view to be expressed. And, one had to do with, there were questions around what the media was doing, how they were handling it. So we specifically said, have a question about the degree to which you think the media would be exaggerating the degree of the disease, to the degree to which it was a risk. Put specific questions around social distancing and your beliefs around whether it's helping, how important is it, how effective is it. Obviously came lots of different questions around policies and whether these restrictions should help. We did another series that I like to use a lot, which was what I call the moment of unity in the US. In mid-March, we had a whole series of questions around whether or not these unprecedented restrictions were necessary or not necessary. Closing down K through 12 schools, closing down most businesses, It's just a series of those items. And that was the moment of unity was, 9 and 10, 8 and 10 Americans said, yes, that was necessary. And then later you see, oh, not so much. So I don't know, that's kind of a range of examples. Scott, what are your favorite measures and how did we come up with them?
Well, one thing I thought of as you were talking is that if the United States were a very small country, maybe along the model of some of the European nations where the population was pretty dense, and everybody was having a relatively shared experience, or at least if there was something really bad happening with COVID in the next province over, you probably knew people from there. But the US is not like that. It's extremely large and dispersed. And the experiences that people are having in rural areas, far from the urban centers, were quite different. And we also know that our politics is distributed in that way, with rural areas being much more Republican and conservative than the urban areas. And so you had these sort of overlapping things that were driving attitudes and perceptions about the virus that meant that we needed to try to think about how can we more directly capture that. So just to make this as brief as possible, I'll just point out that one thing that we wanted to do is see if we could measure the objective extent to which people were experiencing COVID-19 in their area by using some of the databases that the news organizations at Johns Hopkins and others researchers were accumulating to be able to say, these are people, we know exactly where our panelists live. These are people who are living within a short distance of viral outbreaks. And so then we were able to incorporate that variable into our data, and we could then look at how much power personal experience, or at least proximity, was having on people's attitudes. And not to give away all of the secrets here, but I think I made this comment in the chat earlier on. What we found is that very quickly after the partisan signaling began happening from the leadership in the country, attitudes, perceptions of seriousness, the notion that the problem is exaggerated, those things suddenly became almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely driven by partisanship rather than personal experiences. And you can see the signal from personal experiences. People, conservative Republicans who live in rural areas where there had been outbreaks were more worried about it than similar people who were living in places that didn't have the outbreaks. But we were able to show pretty clearly that that at least the political reactions and the perceptions had a very substantial partisan component to it, apart from the lived reality.
And it's driven by Trump, right? Did you have a question about the Trump effect?
Oh yes, we've asked about him and perceptions, of him and how he's approached it and whether he's taken it seriously enough. So we have direct measures that most people who support him believe that the outbreak is less serious, and you saw it in the very first graph, I think, that Carrie put up.
Yeah.
To that point, we have a great trio of questions in the chat right now about, I think, really politics, religion, and values, right? So there's a question about how you measured Trump effect. There's a question about data on religion and COVID, and then a question about the so-called liberty value, the liberty safety value trade-off. So protests against lockdown. And these questions, politics, religion, liberty, they fit so nicely with some of what Pew tackles. So I'm wondering if you can talk about some more of the aspects of how you embedded that in and what you found.
We definitely cover a lot of religion. In fact, we definitely are looking at that as a separate angle, if you will, of implications around the effect of the coronavirus outbreak. In fact, what I usually say in terms of the Pew Research Center is that we are taking that kind of holistic view. We're interested in all of these angles, and we kind of work in these research beats, if you will, around kind of the political angles, the religious implications, and the degree to which people might be turning more to their spiritual lives or less to their spiritual lives. Their feelings about going to a place of worship, for example, is another thing they've looked at, and the kind of their, and I'll leave it at that. And the, what else do we look at? The media, evaluations of the media and the media's handling. You know, my work is focused on the implications of science for society. So we're particularly interested in what I see as, you know, this is a key moment for science that's more visible than ever before. The role of scientists is particularly important. So we were particularly interested in people's trust in scientists, as well as their beliefs around a vaccine coming and other implications from the scientific research that's underway right now. And we're going to come back to politics and values. I just would say in terms of politics, we have just a very active group that's trying to look at all these implications. But one of the earliest measures we took were performance ratings, just how are different groups in society handling the coronavirus outbreak. And so you're just trying to capture that range. And so we had public health officials on there, we had Donald Trump on there, we had the news media, we had local elected officials as well as state elected officials. Those are the main ones. And again, it kind of, those measures have been extremely useful in terms of capturing overall sentiment. But all of these measures are really useful from an analytic lens because you're seeing where the divides in society are emerging. And so certainly from the early days there, you saw generally strong bipartisan support for the role of state and local elected officials, but then that partisan divide around anything connected with Donald Trump.
So I'm curious to follow up on this because in some ways you have the kind of reach and influence that the rest of us on the call can only just dream of having in terms of the way that Pew can speak to broad audiences and share results. And so I'm curious how you think about the relationship between driving the conversation versus following where the conversation is going more broadly. So like pursuing the themes that are coming up in the news cycle versus the themes that you think really should cut through and be the ways people analyze this. So, I mean, one example that comes to mind here is the question of viewing this through partisan lenses versus religious lenses versus other kinds of analytical categories. So how do you grapple with that tension between sort of trying to follow where the priorities are broadly versus being able to sort of frame and set the priorities in some ways?
I would say we lean more on the side of measuring. And so we're more interested in capturing, you know, our mission is to better understand the issues and trends shaping America and the world. So it is focused on the understanding. And then let's get Scott in for a word in edgewise.
Well, you know, I absolutely concur with that. You know, we have strong DNA built in to say that we aren't the story, we're telling the story. But one thing that is worth mentioning about the center and how unique it is that its original concept was as a place where social science and journalism would meet. And so the very first leader of the Times Mirror Center, our predecessor, was a LA Times journalist. And, you know, we work day by day, side by side with former journalists. You know, I think of them still as journalists, but they're particularly data savvy people, but they have that kind of sense of news judgment that good journalists have, the ability to kind of look over the horizon and see what's around the bend or what's coming. And that allows us in some ways to seem like we might be driving the agenda, but I think it's also based on some ability to try to think about what is coming inevitably and be ready for it, and have content available to speak to it when it becomes a source of public concern. So, it's that melding of journalism and social science is part of what I think helps us do what you're asking about.
Now, I think I can add one more thought on that, which is that I think much of our work right now is towards things that we think will be around long enough that we can actually produce social research that's relevant, right? So you're really only looking at the kind of big picture issues that we think are going to have a lasting impact, because it takes a year, sometimes 2 years, actually sometimes longer, to actually just produce the research. So we do have a leaning towards those kinds of I think bigger themes in society, and what that means is that if they're that big and important, they're going to have a big day today, and they're going to come around again in another month or 6 months or whatever.
There's a great question here in the chat from Bryn about the sharing of results with the media and the like. And if I can broaden it slightly, I guess I'm curious what sort of counts as success in dissemination and in the medium and long term in terms of what happens with this kind of social research you're talking about.
We have a very large and active communications team. Each of the research areas has one or more communications associates assigned to it. And we have a well-developed media philosophy that speaks to what are our target audiences, who are we trying to reach, what are the best ways to do that. We're probably best known for writing reports and releasing them, but we do a tremendous amount of briefings, presentations, and the like. And it's an extremely conscious process. In the early days of the center, it was more a kind of seat of the pants thing, and relationships that the leaders of the center had with individual journalists, and using journalists as a way to get the word out on the reports that we did. And that's changed a lot with the rise of the internet and a much more systematic approach to it. But Carrie's working day to day in the trenches with the media team, the communications team. Let her add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we provide everything directly to the public on our website, but at the end of the day, even though the media landscape has changed dramatically, we still all rely on it because it still helps us reach so many more people. So it's still important, right? Even if you only read a snippet in a news outlet that interests you, you got exposed to it. And if you want to know more, you can go find it. So, reaching audiences through the news media is still really helpful.
We're almost out of time here, but I do just want to ask a couple more sort of focused questions on operationalizations of measures. So there's a really interesting one here in the chat about the question of how you measure things like trust in science. The question from Jenna specifically asks about how you get at these kinds of meanings, particularly when there are things like social desirability bias and the like. So how do you operationalize those kinds of concepts, either in or beyond the COVID context?
Okay, I think, yes, we do blunt questions, but I think we also do nuanced questions. It really just depends a little bit. In terms of trust in science and trust generally, we've done actually a lot of work on trust in groups and institutions. So we do a couple of things. Number one is I mentioned before that we get some of our interpretive power out of the trends over time. So that's one, I think, important tool that we use. Even if you don't love the measure, you're looking to see whether it's going up, down, or stable, and that tells you something important. Number two, we do a lot of these comparative series. So especially in terms of trust in groups and institutions, You're interested in trust in scientists compared to what? So you're wanting to look at a whole series of ratings in terms of trust. And that has been extremely useful. I think we've done that a lot of times. And it is extremely helpful to have that kind of context. It's a way in which to understand the exact percentage, whether that's a little or a lot. And the third thing in terms of trust itself, actually is that asking ourselves that question, trust to do what? Trust in what way? And so most of our measures say something, trust to do something. So the core one that we rely on is a rating of confidence. How much confidence do you have in these different groups to act in the best interests of the public? Now, that's what I call kind of our core general rating of trust. We've also tried to unpack it. We all were talking about how trust is multidimensional, and in essence, trust is most of the scholarly definitions of trust talk about trust as a kind of expectation for the future, an expectation for future behavioral interactions, perhaps. And so one way we tried to go deep on these dimensions of trust was to kind of build off of that sense of expectation. So we ended up asking people, I believe it was, how often can you trust a particular type of scientist to do something? And in this case, to act with competence, to act with caring. And the third one was kind of trusted in the information, but to kind of present their research in a kind of credible way. That was not the exact wording, but that was the kind of the three main dimensions we were trying to get at. And that worked out really well as well, I think, in terms of capturing some of that nuance. And then we tried to push on, well, if there is, a lack of trust, where would these sources of mistrust be coming from? And so we tried to use a similar kind of parallel construction to get at some of those potential sources of mistrust and to measure that. So I don't know. So that's just a little more on subject dear to my heart. So going into long detail.
No, that's fantastic. And it takes me back to a project I worked on a long time ago looking at trust in scientists, where we used a whole bunch of scenario-based examples and experimentally varied things like the scientist's gender and looked at effects on trust there and found some significant results. But there's so many more questions to ask you here, but unfortunately, we're out of time. And so I just want to thank you both, Carrie and Scott, for joining us today and for sharing so generously of your insights and your experience in this. If you have any links you'd like to share with the group, we're happy to post that on the website and make those resources available under our historical speakers list. And I would encourage everyone watching to check out the Pew Research website, because there are regularly great releases coming out and lots of different items and scales and instruments that you might want to be able to be inspired by and perhaps even borrow and cite. So really great stuff there. I hope you'll join us next week, same time, same place. We'll be following this question of recruitment a little further and talking with Daniel Goldfarb from RIWI, who does some really innovative stuff around recruiting from websites for populations that might not otherwise engage in survey work. And then the week after that, we're going to take a fun little deviation into surveying about predictions of the future and hear about forecasting tournaments and the like as survey opportunities around COVID. So thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you next week. As always, you can catch up with the posted videos online. And please feel free to share this link with your colleagues and others. It's been a pleasure. See you next week.
Thank you
very much.